we've discussed the exogenous growth model, the production function of output per worker, given levels of capital per worker, and we found that the main driver that it would indicate is that it's really productivity growth, that it's technology that increases our ability to use capital, our ability to produce things given our capital stock, and that this productivity growth is really what would grow the economy. But I've also said that there's a number of other growth models in macroeconomics, including the endogenous growth model, institutional growth models. There's different growth models that have come out of the World Bank, such as the Washington Consensus, which has a bit of a negative connotation to it depending on the group. There's a lot of discussion around it itself, but different levels of what the government should look like and what international expansion and aid should look like as well. And then there's also individuals who have written a lot about the obvious importance of different types of energy in the economy, and that there's particular times when specific energies have been really useful, such as coal for the Industrial Revolution that really helped the United States, or for example oil that has been really useful for plastics and for cars for driving and for transportation, and that was incredibly useful in the late 20th century, throughout the 20th century, and that helped certain countries there, and that we saw some extra growth. Now we're starting to see some extra growth from fracking and from natural gas and those types of energies that are even more productive and useful now. So I go through all of that just to say that there's a number of different types and theories on sources of economic growth. And here I'm just walking through a few of these that come up from time to time. Over here on sources of growth, this is the main summary. It really comes from either labor growth, and as in most of the data we've looked at, we've standardized the labor growth, so we've taken that into account. We've looked at real GDP per person or per capita. And then that would leave us with really two different levels that we can pull: capital growth or productivity growth. And all of this kind of falls into this. This is also known as growth accounting. And growth accounting tries to break down GDP growth into these three different categories. And we see that long-run growth does tend to come from total factor productivity or productivity growth. But you can have short-term growth from capital growth. And we've seen a number of Asian countries, for example, that have done a lot of, they've invested a lot of capital, and they've kind of overheated the economy in that they get growth from just in essence making workers more productive in that way. However, as we've looked at, that's really more of a short-term solution or a medium-term solution, that might not lead to sustained levels of growth. So here I just want to walk through a number of these, and this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a number of things here. One, we can increase the investment in the capital stock itself. And that's exactly what I was talking about here, where we can really just buy faster computers, right? This would be like faster computers. This would be computers here. This would be upgrading to a better internet service, right? Those types of things. The shift in labor towards productive industries. You can think about high-tech industries here. One good thing that you could think about here is like the difference between Silicon Valley or San Francisco in the United States, or even Boston or Austin or New York City, right? Cities, Chicago, cities that have labor that are really in high-tech industries versus labor that is in agriculture, for example, or labor that would be in like manufacturing. Not that there isn't high-tech in manufacturing, but relatively speaking, it's not as productive per worker. Increasing the level of education, training, skills, or research and development, this all gets into kind of the general thing that we think about as human capital here. And human capital, this tends to be an argument for more government intervention to increase levels of education and retraining, to increase the ability of individuals to move from one sector of the economy to another sector of the economy, and that investment is very useful. Higher levels of human capital here would really get into productivity growth, because here we're saying that you are better suited towards the work when you have productivity growth as a result of better education, that you can do more given the capital that you have. Finding efficiencies in cost as output levels increase. This is really finding efficiencies or kind of returns of scale here. If we want to think about that, reducing the barriers to entry or barriers to trade, this is really increasing, right? This is kind of another way of saying increasing the market, increasing the market. And what do we know about output? Well, output is equal to, right, this is equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports, exports minus imports. And if we increase the market, well, then we have the possibility of exporting goods. And if we increase the market internally, we get some more competition there that should drive down price, but even though it's driving down price, it should increase quantities. And hopefully we would have a quantity effect that weighs out that price effect, that would increase consumption and incentivize more investment as well. Expand legal protections for workers and innovation. Here we're really starting to get into kind of the institutions within the economy. And these legal protections are particularly important, and when we talk about legal protections, we're almost always talking about property rights. And property rights really get at, this is really kind of getting at innovation. This really says innovation here. How much are you willing to risk on an innovation if you don't necessarily own the property right, or if that the government can take it away, or if an elite class can take away the gains there? So it's all about protecting those gains so that individuals are incentivized to invest in the economy. And if you invest in the economy, you've got investment here in capital growth, but you also have an investment in technologies. And if you have those technologies that create productivity growth here, then you can have some lasting growth as well. Establish clear and fair regulations that increase productive uses of capital. We can think about the financial industry here for just as one example, financial industry here. And the financial industry, if you remember back to 2007, 2008, there were regulations in place, but they were not being, the regulations were in place in name only. They weren't actually being regulated. We had banks that were doing things that were not taking capital. They weren't taking our savings and putting them to productive uses. They were instead trying to repackage loans. We were doing things that were creatively capital, and they were capturing, in essence, it was capturing economic output. It was capturing gains, but those captured gains were going to individuals in the form of fees. It wasn't going back towards reinvestment into the economy. And so the clear and fair, they must be actually regulated and they must be enforced. So there must also be enforcement here. If you're going to have regulations, you must have enforcement. And establish an independent central bank and adopt floating or exchange rates. This really gets to monetary policy here. Monetary policy. And the main thing that we're discussing here in monetary policy is that it must be relatively clear what's going on, and it must be independent. You have to have some sort of way that market forces can impact the economy and that you can respond to them. And if you're going to have market forces impacting the economy, which basically allows for trade, you also have to have an independent central bank that can then manage the money supply. These are things that we will get into later on in our discussion of macroeconomics, but I put it here to just introduce that some of the sources of economic growth really come back to these institutions. And this would just be yet another institution here where you have to have faith and you have to have legal protections for those to work. When individuals have those faiths, we tend to see higher levels of innovation. And innovation, in the short run, we get capital growth, we get kind of investment in innovation and in capital, but in the long run, those innovations can increase our productivity growth. And this productivity growth is really, all of this continues to come back to total factor productivity, that productivity growth can lead to sustained levels of economic growth. It's all a matter of figuring out what is the best way to create an incentive for productivity growth.